Imagine sitting in a prison cell because you wore clothes that were too fancy, or because your goose offended your neighbor. Sounds absurd? In the Middle Ages, that was the law. Trials were held in barns, people were arrested without evidence, and punishments were handed out for things that today would barely raise an eyebrow. Welcome to the dark and ridiculous reality of medieval justice. If you think you understand how justice worked back then, stick around. Because these laws didn't just punish, they ruined lives. No logic, no mercy. And it all starts with a man and a cloak he should have never worn. Part 1. The Law of Fabric and Bones. Sir Roger de Marley stepped out of the tavern just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, his boots scraping against cobblestone slick from spilled ale. A half-finished goblet dangled from his hand. He felt proud. No, more than that. He felt like someone. His shoulders were wrapped in a brand-new cloak, deep crimson, trimmed with ferret fur, the kind of cloth that shimmered even under dying daylight. The tailor had done wonders. It fit like armor and whispered wealth with every step. What Roger didn't know, what nobody warned him about, was that this single act of looking better than he should was a crime. As he strutted across the village square, people turned their heads. Some watched with curiosity, others with silent irritation. And then came the sound of footsteps, measured, sharp, and deliberate. A man in a dark robe stepped into Roger's path, tall, gaunt, with a face like it had been carved from dried leather. No greeting, no warning. The man reached out, ran 2 fingers across the fur trim, narrowed his eyes, and said with disdain, "What's your rank?" Roger blinked. He gave a half chuckle, thinking maybe this was some drunk joke. "Excuse me?" But the officer, because that's what he was, snapped his fingers. 2 guards appeared like ghosts. One gripped Roger's arm. The other pulled out a feathered pen and poked it right into the fabric of the cloak, inspecting the threads like he was examining evidence at a murder scene. No one explained anything. No one had to. Roger was already guilty. They took him straight to the town hall. No time to change. No time to speak. The trial began before he could even catch his breath. The chamber was damp and narrow, its stone wall streaked with soot. The air smelled like mildew and burnt oil. At the far end sat a monk, ancient, motionless, eyes cold as ice. He didn't even look at Roger as he read the charges aloud in a low, emotionless voice. Violation of the law of luxury, attempted impersonation of the noble class, unauthorized use of dyed cloth, forbidden embroidery, and ferret fur. Materials strictly reserved for gentlemen of 6th rank and above. Roger stood in silence. He didn't even know such a law existed. But it did. It had been on the books since the late 1200s, and it was detailed. Unbelievably detailed. These were the sumptuary laws, rules that dictated what you could wear, eat, or own, based entirely on your birth and status. If you were a blacksmith, velvet was illegal. If you were a farmer, even dark green wool could get you fined. It wasn't about logic. It was about reminding you where you belonged. Roger wasn't the only one on trial. Sitting beside him was a butcher, red-faced and trembling. His offense? He had roasted and eaten a swan, not hunted it, not stolen it, just cooked it for his family. But swans were royal food, reserved for the king, his court, and no one else. The judge, a bloated man with rings on every finger, slammed his gavel and shouted, "That's blasphemy against the throne." Roger never got a chance to explain. He tried. He said the cloak was a gift, that he didn't know the rules, that he could return it, sell it, burn it. But the court didn't care. They had made their decision before he ever opened his mouth. The punishment. 12 silver coins, a full year's earnings for someone like him. When he couldn't pay, they sentenced him to 2 weeks in the public shame cage. The cage wasn't symbolic, it was real. A wooden prison, built right beside the main road, designed to humiliate. He was shoved inside with a cobbler who'd made boots for a wealthy merchant. The boots had a golden clasp. That was enough to land him in the same cell. People spat as they walked by. Some tossed rotting vegetables. Children laughed and pointed. And every hour, the church bell rang, reminding the whole town. These two broke the order. As Roger sat there, legs curled beneath him, the red cloak now stained and ripped, he watched the law in action. A man near the fountain was being beaten. 2 guards, without hesitation, striking him with short sticks. His crime? Eating roasted chicken too loudly, within earshot of a local noble, during a holiday, no less. That was considered brazen feasting beyond one's rank. In fact, in some villages, peasants weren't even allowed to cook poultry unless they had written permission from their landlord. The logic? Simple. If your food sounded expensive, it probably was. And that, by itself, was a problem. Other laws were just as brutal. In certain regions, peasants couldn't drink wine, even if they harvested the grapes. Some towns banned women from wearing jewelry unless their husbands served the crown. There were lists posted in taverns that showed what colors each trade was allowed to wear. If you were a tailor, no purple. A cook, no blue. A carpenter, only brown or gray. Break the rules once, pay a fine. Twice, expect flogging or jail time. The message was clear. Status wasn't earned, it was enforced. And if you forgot that, the law was there to remind you. Loudly. The system didn't just regulate behavior, it crushed identity, turned fashion into a trap, made celebration feel like rebellion. Even a single stitch in the wrong fabric could turn your life upside down. So Roger sat in that cage, heart pounding, watching his future unravel thread by thread. Above him, the same cloak that had made him feel like someone now hung limp and soaked, pinned to a beam as evidence. And only now did he understand. In this world, a splash of color could cost you your freedom. And if you think that's absurd, wait until you see what happened in the village of Saint-Martin, where the next defendant had 4 legs and a curly tail. Part 2. The Trial of the Animals. In the quiet village of Saint-Martin, dawn didn't break with birdsong or the tolling of the church bell. It started with a scream, and not the kind that comes from fear or injury. No, this was sharper, shriller. One word cut through the misty morning air like a blade. "The pigs are being charged with blasphemy." No one laughed. No one asked if it was a joke. They just grabbed their cloaks and headed toward the hill where the old stone chapel stood. First came the farmers, then the monks from the priory, then merchants with heavy eyes, even elders leaning on sticks. People shuffled out of bed and into the square like it was Judgment Day. And in a way, it was. Because if animals were now standing trial, what else was possible? Near the chapel steps stood the village elder, his face flushed and furious, flanked by a monk gripping a scroll. The parchment was large, official, and rattled in the breeze as the monk began to read. 6 swine entered the sacred chapel, overturned the offertory box, trampled the altar cloth, and, most grievously, gnawed upon the holy pedestal. Gasps swept through the crowd, not because of the damage, but because the law was clear. Any desecration of a holy space, intentional or not, was a spiritual offense, even if the accused walked on 4 legs and snorted. The pigs had been caught earlier that morning, and penned beside the chapel in a makeshift wooden corral. They were filthy, covered in soot and dust from the baker's collapsed oven nearby. 2 of them limped. One had a patch of dried blood behind its ear, but all eyes landed on the biggest one, pink, round, with a clipped left ear and a certain reputation. Her name was Agatha. And yes, she had a name. Everyone in the village market knew her. She was clever. She liked to dig up vegetables from behind fences. She once chased the mayor's dog down an alley. She was a handful, but a familiar one. Now she stood in the pen, trembling, with a rough wooden placard hung around her neck. It read, "Ringleader." The trial that followed wasn't symbolic. This was a real court session, complete with a bailiff, public attendance, and even an official clerk. The church bell rang once, then again, as a signal that the trial was underway. A guard in chainmail read the charges on behalf of the community and the church. Witnesses were called. A boy, no older than 10, nervously stepped forward and claimed, under oath, that during morning prayer, one of the pigs let out a loud grunt that made the priest stumble over his Latin. People murmured. Some chuckled under their breath, but the judges remained still. No smiles, no hint of mercy. And then, something few today would believe, a defense attorney stepped forward. Not for the boy, not for the priest, for the pig. In the Middle Ages, animals could have legal representation, and Agatha did. Her defender was a monk from a nearby monastery, known for his long sermons and even longer eyebrows. He stood tall, adjusted his robe, and began his argument with surprising calm. He said the pigs did not understand the sanctity of the space, that their actions weren't malicious, but driven by hunger, that no gate stood between the chapel and the open field. If God gave them snouts, he said, he did not grant them conscience. The crowd was silent. For a moment, it felt like the absurdity might collapse under its own weight. But then the lead judge, a pale man with sunken cheeks and a black wooden cross around his neck, simply nodded. Guilty. Agatha was sentenced to public execution at sunrise. The 5 remaining pigs were banished from the village, labeled as accomplices. Any villager who harbored them would be fined 2 silver coins and stripped of church blessings. On Saturday morning, as the sun barely touched the rooftops, the villagers gathered in the square. Some brought bread. Others brought straw to sit on. It had the feel of a festival, but with a gallows instead of music. Agatha was tied to a cart, a fresh placard around her neck that read, "Desecrator of the House of God." Before the sentence was carried out, a small fire was lit beside the platform. They burned the damaged altar cloth to purify the earth. Some villagers prayed, others just watched in silence. Agatha never squealed, not once. And when it was over, the elder gave a nod. The remaining pigs were herded out through the northern gate. None looked back. But if you think this was a one-off medieval oddity, think again. In the town of Montauban, down in southern France, a rooster was brought to trial. The reason? It laid an egg. To the townspeople, that wasn't a miracle. It was a warning. A male chicken wasn't supposed to do that. So they panicked. The priest claimed the egg was unnatural, a sign of unclean forces. The rooster was seized, chained to a post, tried by a church tribunal, and found guilty of dark association. He was burned publicly. And his owner? Fined for knowingly harboring a suspicious creature. It gets stranger. In one Swiss village, a barn infested with ants was served a court summons. The priest and the notary arrived with a scroll declaring the ants had 3 days to vacate the premises. The reading was done aloud. Loud enough, they said, for the creatures to hear and comply. The ants stayed. A second session was held. A ruling was made. The colony was judged guilty of property invasion and sentenced to removal. The sentence was carried out by boiling water and shovels. None of this is legend. These stories are documented in medieval legal records, chronicles, and ecclesiastical archives. They weren't jokes. They weren't myths. They were justice, as it was understood then. And what's truly staggering is not that these trials happened. It's that people believed in them. They spent money, time, and effort just to convict creatures who had no idea what laws even were. But if you think tying up a pig or charging a rooster with blasphemy was the strangest thing that passed for justice, wait until you hear about the man who was fined for singing to his donkey, and another who got locked up for baking the wrong kind of bread. Because next, it gets even more absurd. Part 3. The madness of bells, bread, and shoelaces. Tucked between mossy hills and overgrown pastures, the village of Lockholm was as quiet as a painted postcard. And no one fit that silence better than Jake, the local shepherd. He kept to himself, didn't drink, didn't fight, didn't meddle in other people's problems. Every evening, just as dusk settled over the thatched rooftops, Jake would walk to the stable, lean against the wooden frame, and hum a melody to his old donkey. No words, just soft, slow notes carried on the evening breeze. It was his ritual, his way of ending the day. Gentle, harmless, honest. Until one fall morning changed everything. A messenger arrived with a sealed letter from the village council, wax-stamped. Official. Jake opened it with calloused fingers and frowned as he read. He was being summoned to court. The charge? Breaking the silence after the 9th bell. As strange as it sounds, this wasn't new. Back in the 14th century, a law was passed requiring absolute quiet after the village church rang 9 times. No songs, no laughter, no conversations above a whisper, all in the name of spiritual stillness and community order. The law had been forgotten for decades, but someone remembered. And that someone was Jake's neighbor, a bitter old man named Walter, who apparently didn't appreciate lullabies meant for donkeys. The court didn't ask for context. They didn't care about intent. Jake explained he wasn't performing, just humming to calm an animal. The judge barely looked up. Peace is more important than feelings. Jake was fined 3 silver coins and warned, next time, it won't be just a fine. And if you think that's the height of absurdity, think again. A few weeks later, Thomas the baker was hauled into court. He was cheerful, young, and famous in the village for his bread, especially the warm, fragrant loaves that made the whole street smell like home. One morning, Thomas got creative. He baked a new kind of bread, longer, with a pocket of dried berries inside. People loved it. But one customer didn't, because that customer wasn't a customer at all. He was a market inspector. The next day, Thomas stood in front of a judge who cited a statute passed in 1266. The bread assize, it was called. According to this ancient law, every loaf had to weigh exactly 1 pound, have a uniform shape, and contain no surprises inside. Any hollow space was considered suspicious, proof of trickery or worse. Some believed hidden pockets in bread were signs of greed. Others whispered it might be tied to curses. The court didn't bother with speculation. They ruled fast. Thomas was guilty of misleading customers. His bakery was shut down for 3 weeks. He was locked in the town hall's stone pantry. No fire, no blanket, just cold walls, a wooden bench, and a bowl of dried peas with a pitcher of water. And then came Ellen. She wasn't a baker or a singer, just a vendor at the weekly market. She sold herbs and handmade laces. One morning, she tied her shoelaces in a decorative cross pattern. It was just for style. But a guard saw it, stopped her, and dragged her to the magistrate. Why? Because the cross was sacred, and by wearing it on her feet, they said she was disrespecting the symbol. She wasn't imprisoned, but she wasn't free either. For 2 days, she was assigned to clean the monastery stables under strict supervision. Every morning, the priest reminded her, "Not everything beautiful is permitted." The absurdity didn't end there. Edward, the village blacksmith, was strong, soot-covered, and practical. One rainy season, he built a wooden awning beside his forge, so he could keep working during storms. But the edge of that awning cast a shadow over his neighbor's fence, and that was illegal. A recent ordinance declared that a shadow, yes, a shadow, couldn't cross property lines. Why? Because shadows, they claimed, were part of your land's spiritual footprint. By letting his roof block the sun, Edward had projected his structure onto someone else's domain. He was called before the village council. He was told to tear the awning down. A repeat offense, that would cost him a working ox. It sounds like satire, but it wasn't. The law also banned dogs from barking at night, not because it was noisy, but because it was believed that barking after dark meant the dog was sensing evil nearby. And if your dog sensed evil, that meant you failed to keep evil out. First offense, a fine. Second, the dog would be taken to a monastery for spiritual purification. And it gets worse. In some regions, you couldn't drink from someone else's stream, even if you were lost, parched, and hadn't had water for days. The stream was considered private natural property. If you were caught dipping your hands in it, you weren't seen as thirsty. You were seen as stealing. And the most terrifying part? There were no signs, no warnings, no public list of rules nailed to a post. You never really knew what would get you in trouble, until you were already guilty. One slip, one step, one song. That's all it took. People lived in constant anxiety. Did I break a law without knowing it? What if I get punished for something that used to be okay last year? There were no clear answers, and once judgment came down, there was no mercy. This wasn't justice, it was control through confusion, a system designed to trap, not protect. Rules weren't there to keep order, they were there to keep you small. You could lose your freedom for a melody, lose your livelihood for a loaf of bread, be branded a criminal for a shadow or a shoelace. And in a world like that, no one ever truly felt safe. Not yesterday, not today, not tomorrow. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't just live, you survived inside a maze of absurd laws, where every wrong move came with a price.